Hey everybody out there, my name is Dragnix, and it's time to talk some game design on the channel today. I've wanted to do more of these videos since I started the channel, and now that I'm more focused on letting the other job pay the bills, you'll probably see more of these types of videos in the channel's future. So for today, let's talk about one of my favorite developers in the present day video game landscape, Platinum Games. Now I'm guessing that I'm not alone in that. They made some of the most interesting action games and cult hits like Vanquish, and of course, Bayonetta 2. In fact, the first game design video that I did on this channel was about Bayonetta 2, and how the optional Muspelheim missions ended up teaching the players mechanics that they needed to survive the game's challenge. I'll link the video here somewhere, although keep in mind, this is when I first started, so I'm a little bit fast with my dialogue. And you know what? Not much has changed when it comes to their ability to teach the player naturally through the game's mechanics. In fact, it's a major part of today's video. Although, maybe not in the way that you normally expect. Because it's a mechanic that's present in every action game out there. Hell, it's in pretty much every open world game as well. So, with Nier Automata being the focus of today's video, what mechanic could I possibly talk about? Am I talking about the chip system that allows for multiple playstyles and a specialization in certain traits? Could I be talking about the dodging system and the ability to position yourself correctly in the lines of battle? Or am I talking about the uniqueness of each weapon and how they change the way that you have to approach combat? Well, none of those. Today, I'll be talking about how the game teaches you through the camera. Yes, the camera. Which may sound weird to you at first. I mean, you're probably sitting here watching this video and saying to me right now, Dragnix. A camera is present in every game in some form or another. It just gives you the ability to see what's going on in the battlefield. Sure, a camera plays a big part in the gameplay, but how can a camera perspective teach you how to play the game? You have to learn how to hit the enemies. You have to learn how to use the button presses wisely. Come on, Dragnix. It's just a vessel for you to be able to do that. But the mechanics learned, they're inside the main combat. So okay, tell me what we're really talking about today. Come on, go on, Dragnix. And I sit here and say to you, my own scripts seem to think my audience thinks I'm crazy. I probably should really work on that, but I'm serious. Yes, a camera is present in all games. But like any mechanic in a game, it's a matter of how it's used and implemented over a game's life. And Nier Automata uses the camera a lot differently than other games out there. See, the mysterious cameraman that gives you the view in Nier Automata, well, he's got a bit of a unique quirk to him. Most cameramen pick one or two perspectives to work with in terms of angle, in terms of depth from the player model. Sure, you may be able to move him at times, but it's generally the same. But in Nier Automata, things are a bit different. In fact, they are constantly different, as the camera is always changing perspective, forcing more linear parts at times, while being just strange at others. But what you may not realize is that the arrangement of these perspectives, one after another, can actually help teach you little tricks to help you in combat. Platinum didn't just put the camera on a swivel and randomly throw it around. Each perspective serves a purpose to introduce new elements of the game, especially at the start. And no, not teach you like a tutorial, aka directly tell you what you need to do. They are subtle hints that the game provides you just by the combat scenarios alone. Knowing that, let's start directly from the beginning of the game. And of course, we'll start with 2B's badass entrance that I'll play in its entirety because, well, it's just sort of badass.
Alert. Heavy damage. Standard top laser test initiating short range control. Activating short-range attack gear. Alert. Large enemy group detected.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
A pretty nice entrance if you ask me. But beautiful character reveals aside, the game has already set up some information for us to process. Now, This part isn't unique to Nier Automata, not at all. This is in every action game which starts up. But I want to present the information in question to give you perspective of what normal games do to teach you a tiny bit. The game starts off with 5 enemies placed directly in front of us in an arc-like fashion. They are a significant amount away from 2B despite being melee enemies, allowing for you to get a good view of them before you have to attack. Now, the enemy configuration here is simple, not complicating the situation with multiple enemy types or even placing them out of view. Basically, the game tells you this simply: here's some enemies, kill them, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of extra noise to complicate the situation. But already, Nier Automata does something that most games don't do with this opening setup. Notice each of the enemies in question, and in particular, the space behind them. 2 things should jump out to you. 1, the lighting. On the left side, you'll notice the darker area that the 2 enemies are in, but it also lets you see those enemies in the darkness thanks to their glowing eyes. The game has already taught you something. Enemies can be seen in the dark and will lurk in it, and you'll have to watch out for them. Now, some may not make that connection at first, but that's not on the game if you don't notice that. It gave you the opportunity. Secondly, notice the second enemy to the right. Notice how at first you may not notice him because he blends into the rocks and debris behind him. Again, the game's opening perspective has taught you something. Enemies can blend into environments and you'll have to look carefully in order to see them. Now again, this is the opening ground combat action sequence, so you shouldn't expect too much information to process here, as you wouldn't want to overload the player. But we haven't had to change perspectives yet, so let's move on to the first perspective change that the game gives us. A little bit different, wouldn't you say? In fact, the game is now pretty much a side-scroller, and you don't have control of the camera at this point. So we have to ditch all the information that we've learned up to this point, right? No. In fact, it's still really useful. Take for example the blending in. Notice the robot here, and how he can blend in with the piping a tiny bit. Not as much as before, but still, if you're not paying attention here, you could end up running into him. But okay, with this new perspective, what else can we learn? Well, let's play it for a tiny bit and see what happens. So in this new perspective, we've removed a dimension, and the game has introduced a new type of enemy, a flying drone that shoots balls of energy. But in this restricted introduction, the game has introduced several simple mechanics. First, that enemies can come from above, and so we've got to look up in order to make sure to take care of threats coming from above. But you may ask, Dragnix, why couldn't they do that with the normal camera angle? Well, they could, but here's the thing. By removing a factor of dimension, they've made the lesson that much simpler. If you had to deal with ground enemies as well as flying enemies in the 3D dimension for the first time, it would take you some time to get used to moving the camera around in the vertical direction, and you may not notice other elements that I'm about to talk about that this section taught. In short, it removed complexity with a simple camera angle change. But let's go back for a second. What else did this section teach us? Well, that enemies can come from behind us. Again, the original battle had everything put in front of us. Now, we have to deal with an ambush. And again, because of the simplification of the camera, we can focus on 2 dimensions of escapability, aka the horizontal and the vertical direction, and only use those to escape the bullets, which will come into play in later battles when we don't want to use the 3rd dimension in order to get close to our opponents. Okay, more smaller lessons to be learned here. Let's go to the next perspective change. This one is a couple of parts, but we've swapped from a side-scroller perspective to an overhead perspective, like good old top-down shooters. Now, there are similarities with the side-scroller format at first glance, but there's actually a lot of differences in the gameplay here. Now, from a range perspective, things are simpler for 2B thanks to the top-down perspective. But what about melee? Well, it's actually a lot harder. This has everything to do with the perspective itself. In particular, notice how you can't easily tell the length of your sword and its swipes. Well, mostly. You can see the sword when it's going in front of you and it's swirling around, and that's part of her combo attack. But in most normal cases, it's hard to see the sword against the ground because of the verticality of the situation. It's an implicit lesson on spacing between you and enemies in a smaller environment. It becomes especially important in harder difficulties where you can only take 1 or 2 hits. The game is easing you into the battle style and having to put yourself in a place where enemies are hittable, but you can easily retreat into safety. Okay, it's the start of the game though. It can't keep this up throughout the experience, right? Well, no. That's actually one of the biggest strengths this game has. Its variety in combat, and how the game is still teaching you halfway through the first run. Let me go to a direct example of this. Here we have an early game boss fight in an opera house against a giant dancing singer. It's actually one of the earlier boss fights in the game, so you can expect to use a lot of what you learned up to this point. And the fight starts pretty normally at first, having you focus on one enemy, dodge a bunch of bullets and lasers, while doing small bits of range damage where you can, while you get a little bit closer. Most of the skills will allow you to get a little bit closer to her and actually do some melee damage, which will be significant in the fight. But at a certain stage of the fight, things change. Another interesting angle, very similar to the last overhead angle we were talking about, with one big exception. The camera is zoomed in on the battlefield and doesn't show you all the enemies, which is a big deal, because if you're hit by any of these projectiles, you'll get hacked and could take serious damage because of that. What's also to note is that you can't change the camera angle here. It's fixed in this location, so you can't look around. This really complicates things, as all your skills up to this point really don't help you in this situation. Running randomly in one directions that bullets are coming from will make you run right into them and get hacked. So what can you do? How can you make sure that doesn't happen? And what does this camera perspective do to make you find the solution to this problem? Well, after going through all the possibilities, one thing is left, and one thing is a little bit different than it normally is. Look at the bottom right of the screen, and notice that the radar is a little bit strange. Notice how there's enemies surrounding the arena. That's unheard of, and it doesn't actually affect the battle, except for drawing your eyes to the radar. And then you realize something. The radar is shown where these enemies that I couldn't see in this scenario are. Sure, I know a couple of locations based on the projectiles and the angle they are coming at me, but now the radar is the primary tool. I don't need direct visual confirmation in this case, I already have their location. Let's be clear, the game had you use the radar before, but it was always a secondary option. Yeah, you could be able to see an enemy coming up on you, but you didn't have to rely entirely on it. You would always use visual confirmation before going at an enemy. This lesson, like all the others, comes into play later on in other boss fights and with some of the open world elements of the game. Nier Automata continues to do this over the lifespan of the game, in not only the main missions, but the side missions as well. You learn little elements, like how to adjust to awkward angles based on enemy height, which can come into play when an enemy shows up in an awkward spot in more normal fights. This, as well as being able to use your ranged weaponry more effectively with specific angles and what they end up showing you. The reason why this topic stood out to me is simple. With all the different camera angles here, you normally hear a subset of players say that the gameplay is too hard to adjust to, that it changes way too often and it causes them a lot of problems. But when reading reviews or listening to people's complaints about the game, that never came up. And camera angles are usually one of the biggest points of contention when it comes to action games in particular. And the reason it didn't is simple. Platinum designed the system too well for there to be holes. It naturally taught you everything even if you didn't realize it. Sure, action fans may have adjusted to certain elements rather quickly in the game, but even the most novice player could pick up at the hints that this system was giving. This is why I trust Platinum with their game designs. When it comes to adjusting to the player, it is one of the best in the industry. And more developers need to take notice of what they're doing in order to fulfill that role. Anyway, this is Dragnix signing out, and I hope you found this game design video useful. Again, this is subjective at times. Some people may have different opinions on how the camera system works, and if you do, leave your comments in the comments section below. As for what's next on the channel, it'll probably be a review or a critical eye of some sort. I haven't exactly nailed down what I'm going to look at yet, and while I am playing Breath of the Wild in the background, that's a huge project to undertake in terms of review, and in particular with my review style. Again, that would be hundreds and hundreds of hours put into the game for a game that I can straight up recommend right now. Yes, some people have given it 7 out of 10s. Yes, some people don't have as much of a love for the game as others. But I do think there's a lot of good game design elements in it, and so maybe I'll do a couple game design videos on it. Anyway, I'll see you later, and as always, keep on gaming.